Dusk shrouded the streets of Lakeston City like a heavy blanket under which shadows lurked. The city lived by its own rules, rules steeped in fear and prejudice. There was no light to illuminate the dark corners of people's souls. Whispers of hatred echoed in the alleys, burned in the eyes of passers-by, and echoed in the police sirens that pierced the silence of the night. The Lakeston Police Department, a gray concrete building with peeling paint on the walls, was a symbol of that injustice. Inside the patrol cars sat people who were used to seeing enemies where there were none, and to treating those who wore a different color of skin as suspects. No one in the city doubted it. The law here was just a cover for force, brutality, and fear. One officer stood out among the officers, Jack Langston. His name was whispered anxiously, and his face, with its sternly compressed mouth and cold gray eyes, made one shiver. Langston does not seek justice, it was said of him. He seeks enemies. His reputation was tough, almost legendary. Jack did not tolerate objections, did not listen to explanations, and the sight of strangers aroused in him the animal instinct to suppress, to subdue, to punish. That night, Jack sat in his patrol car at the curb, listening to the radio crackle. He hated this neighborhood, the narrow streets where every movement seemed suspicious, and passers-by turned away at the sight of his car. To him, these people were not part of society. They were strangers who crowded into his city. There was a report on the radio about a woman allegedly disturbing the peace in a nearby park. Jack grinned. The girls, probably one of them again, he thought as he rounded the corner. His fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Tension, barely perceptible, crawled inside the car. Every time he took on another case, he felt that familiar rush, a mixture of superiority, strength, and a strange emptiness. When he pulled up to the park, the evening sky was already consumed by night. The light of the street lamps shook in the fog, and the distant silhouette of the girl on crutches seemed suddenly vulnerable to Jack. She stood motionless, and beside her was a tall horse, calm and majestic. This strange sight irritated him. Why is she here? What is she up to? His thoughts boiled, and his hand slowly slid to his belt where the taser hung. He got out of the car and walked toward her, his every step echoing in the empty park. The girl turned, and there was the fear in her eyes that Jack was so used to seeing. But this time, that fear made him feel something else, an inexplicable feeling, as if there was something in that look that was going to break his inner world. But Jack wasn't prepared for what the evening was hiding. Jack Langston approached the girl slowly, his every movement measured, as if he were approaching a threat rather than a person. The girl, seeing him, took a step backward, leaning on her crutches. Her eyes widened with fear and her lips pressed into a thin line. On her face was a mute question. "Why are you coming to me?" But Jack didn't notice, or didn't want to notice, her vulnerability. To him, she was just part of the crowd he thought was destroying his city. "What are you doing here?" He threw it roughly, clenching his teeth. His voice sounded as if it were an accusation, not a question. The girl looked up, her voice trembling. "I was just waiting. It wasn't my fault." She stood by a wooden bench, holding on to her crutches. Her horse chewed the grass peacefully beside her, as if trying to be inconspicuous. But Langston didn't care. He didn't need an explanation. He needed to find a reason to act. "Waiting?" he interjected with a sneer, stepping closer. "This is no place for people like you. I'm sure you're up to something." "I'm just waiting for a friend," she replied, trying to remain calm, but her voice treacherously shook. "A friend, huh?" Jack looked slowly at the girl and her horse. A picture was already forming in his mind. She could be connected to someone, perhaps someone who was doing something illegal. To him, she was already guilty, her presence proof. He took another step forward, and the girl jerked back, barely keeping her balance on her crutches. The horse clearly didn't like the movement, turned its head toward Jack and snorted loudly. That irritation flashed through him like a spark in dry grass. "Put that thing away," he said, nodding at the horse. "Or I will." She had done nothing wrong. The girl raised her voice, her fear replaced by desperate courage. "We're just waiting. We're not touching anyone." But Jack had stopped listening to her. To him, every word she said was a challenge. Any attempt to explain herself was a show of insolence. His hand slowly reached for the taser, his fingers gripping the handle. The air around him thickened, the tension rising with every second. "I said, put her away." For the last time, his voice became cold, almost machine-like. "You're already breaking the rules." "What rules?" she whispered, realizing that whatever she said would only fuel his anger. She was trapped, alone, defenseless. The only thing left was to hope he would change his mind. But his eyes, cold and empty, said otherwise. Jack, without waiting for her answer, pulled out the taser. At that moment, the girl realized it was pointless to speak. Her voice, her attempts to defend herself, were like ashes that the wind of hatred blew away. "You had your chance," he said, and before she could do anything, he pulled the trigger. A discharge pierced the air, followed by a scream. The girl collapsed to the ground, her crutches fallen beside her with a thud. The horse barked loudly, raising its head to the sky as if protesting this cruelty. But Jack stood still, staring at his victim with contempt. "It's all clear now," he murmured, as if he could convince himself that he'd done the right thing. But his voice trembled, as if something deep inside him was stirring. It seemed to him that the girl was whispering through her tears. "Why?" The question, quiet, almost silent, echoed in his mind. But he had no answer. Before we continue, let's pause for a moment. Write in the comments where you hear our stories from. Perhaps you have faced something similar in your life or heard about similar situations. Share your opinion. It's very important. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss new stories that make you think. And now we continue. Jack Langston stood with his taser in his hand as if it were the key to solving all his problems. The girl hunched on the ground, trying to rise, leaning on her crutches, but they lay helplessly a few feet away. Her face was contorted with fear and pain, and her eyes begged for mercy. Jack, however, saw no humanity in her eyes. To him, she was a symbol of what he hated, of what he thought was destroying his city. "It's your own fault," he said, not even trying to hide the contempt in his voice. "I told you to get out of here, and you decided to test my patience." "Please," the girl whispered, her voice shaking like a leaf in the wind. "I didn't do anything. I was just waiting for a friend." But her words did not reach him. They were just noise to him, empty sound. His gaze slid over her figure, naked in its vulnerability, and stopped at her hands clinging to the ground. To him, her attempts to defend herself seemed pathetic and unworthy. "That's what you all say," he hissed, moving closer to her as if enjoying his power. "It's always you, always the victims, but we both know the truth is different." He pulled the trigger of the taser. The air was filled with the sound of crackling electricity that seemed to tear the night silence to shreds. The discharge struck her, causing her body to arch. She screamed, but her scream was as short as a flash before it drowned out her breath. Her hands clenched into fists, nails digging into the ground, and tears streamed down her cheeks. The horse, which had hitherto stood motionless, rumbled and jerked forward, but pulled on the bridle and stood still. Its large eyes glittered in the darkness, reflecting the tension of the moment. Jack gave the animal a look of annoyance, but his attention returned to the girl. She lay there, her chest heaving, her breaths coming out of her mouth in ragged gasps. She tried to say something again, but her voice wouldn't come out. "That's it. Now do you understand?" he said, crouching down beside her. His words sounded like poison, eating away at her consciousness. "If you think you can do whatever you want, you need to remember who's in charge." "Yeah, just wanted to leave," she whispered, barely audible. Her voice was weak, but it was painful, the pain of someone who'd been robbed of the last thing she had: dignity. Jack pulled away and stood up, looking down at her. He felt victorious, though part of him knew there was no honor in this victory. Her words, quiet, almost lifeless, continued to echo in his ears, but he stubbornly ignored them. Suddenly, something in this moment, in her helplessness, in the still silence around him, made him freeze briefly. That moment lasted only a moment before he pushed away the strange feeling that had barely touched his heart. "Get up," he said, turning away. "If you want to live in peace, get out of my town." But she couldn't get up. Her body was still shaking from the discharge, her crutches lying too far away. The horse rumbled again, stamping insistently on the ground with its hoof, as if protesting what had happened. Jack turned around, looking back at the animal irritably. His hand slid to his gun. "Calm the damn thing down," he gritted his teeth. But the girl, barely regaining consciousness, could not answer. And at that moment his anger reached its limit. Jack took a step toward the horse, and her eyes seemed to look straight into his soul, reflecting not fear, but silent reproach. Jack stood in front of the horse, his gun outstretched, his face frozen in a grimace of rage. The horse kept stomping, neighing and whirling its head, as if it sensed the injustice that was happening before its eyes. It took a step forward and stepped between the girl and Jack, pulling its head out so that its owner would be safe. There was no fear in the animal's eyes, only determination. "Get back!" Jack shouted, pointing his gun at the animal. His voice echoed through the deserted park, but the horse didn't move. On the ground, the girl, trying with her last strength to raise her head, noticed what was happening. Her eyes widened with horror, and she wheezed, barely breathing. "No, please, don't touch her. It's not her fault." "Shut up," he said, not even turning to her. All his rage was now focused on the animal, which he decided was the new symbol of his hatred. "Do you think I'm going to put up with this? Put it away, or I'll put it away myself." The girl, gathering all her strength, reached out to her horse, trying to calm it with her voice. "Princess, quiet. I'm here. Everything will be fine." But the words did not calm either the horse or Langston. He saw in the animal's every movement a challenge to his authority, to his power. To him, it was a matter of principle. He could not allow anyone, even an animal, to stand between him and his decision. His fingers gripped the grip of the gun tighter, and his thumb slid barely perceptibly to the trigger. "I warned you," he said hoarsely, almost in a whisper. His words were addressed not only to the horse, but also to the girl, to her weak voice, which, despite everything, continued to resist. The girl screamed, "No! Please, please! It's just a horse, it can't hurt you!" Her tear-soaked pleas broke the silence, but they didn't reach Jack's heart. To him, it was just another ploy, another attempt to cast a shadow on his decisions. The horse, on the other hand, continued to stand motionless, staring at him intently, as if she knew this moment might be her last. "You asked for it," he whispered, as if talking to an animal, and pulled the trigger. The gunshot sounded louder than anything that had come before. It echoed through the park like a signal of imminent tragedy. The horse sprang forward, its hooves kicking up the ground, but soon it collapsed to its knees, breathing heavily. Thick blood ran through the grass, staining it a dark color. The girl screamed, her voice unbearably shrill, like the sound of broken glass. She tried to crawl to her horse, her hands trembling and her body, still weak from the shocker, failing her. But she did not give up, and soon her fingers touched the animal's soft fur. "Princess, no, please, don't go," she whispered, tears pouring from her eyes mixing with the dirt on her face. She stroked the horse, repeating those words over and over again, as if she believed she could bring it back to life. Jack, standing aside, regarded the scene with cold indifference. His heart, encased in the icy armor of hatred, did not flinch. He knew in his heart that he had crossed the line, but pride and stubbornness prevented him from admitting it. "It's your own fault," he said, lowering the gun. "You shouldn't have gone that far. Remember that the next time you have one." The girl raised her head, her eyes full of pain and hatred. She said nothing more, but there were more words in her gaze than in any speech. It was a look that penetrated Jack's heart, making him feel for a moment that he was not only a policeman, but a criminal. He turned abruptly, got into his car, and drove away, leaving her alone in the park with the body of her only friend. The silence that came after he left was heavier than all the gunshots and screams. The shot rang out, cutting through the night like a shard of glass stabbing into the heart. The sound was loud, almost deafening, but at the same instant it was the beginning of a silence that was far more frightening. The horse gave a short, shrill roar and jerked forward, but its legs gave way and it collapsed on its side. The ground beneath it shuddered and then seemed to freeze, memorizing the moment of its fall. The girl didn't immediately realize what had happened. All she heard was the echo of the gunshot that continued to echo in her ears. Her body, still weak from the shocker, trembled, and her heart pounded as if it wanted to burst out of her chest. She looked at her horse lying in the grass, its strong, beautiful body now looking lifeless, motionless. "No, no, no, no," she whispered, her voice shaking and her words breaking into a scream. She tried to crawl, her hands clawing at the ground, leaving footprints, but the distance between her and her friend seemed endless. When she finally reached the horse, her hands reached for the soft neck, which was still breathing, but with difficulty. Blood, warm and thick, dripped down onto her palms. The girl tried to stop the bleeding, but knew it was useless. "Princess, please, no. You can't leave me. Not now." She sobbed, her words drowned in the silence of the park. Her fingers frantically stroked the horse's fur, her tears dripping onto the grass, mixing with the blood. A police car stood nearby, its headlights illuminating the tragedy with a dim yellow light. Jack Langston, holstering his gun, watched the scene in silence. There was no regret or remorse in his face. To him, it was just another assignment, another day on duty. But deep inside, he felt a strange, unpleasant, burning sensation. He suppressed it immediately, as he always did when faced with his own doubts. "She's just an animal," he said coldly, glaring at the girl. "You should have thought of that before." His words sounded like a slap. The girl raised her head, her face covered with dirt, tears, and pain. There was a rage in her eyes that seemed so strong it would have burned a hole in Jack's soul, if he had any soul left. "She was my friend," she whispered, her voice shaking with anger and grief. "My family. You have no right. You never had the right." But Jack turned away, as if her words didn't matter. He didn't want to listen, didn't want to see her pain, because somewhere deep inside he knew she was right. It was easier for him to pretend it didn't matter. "Get out of here," he said over his shoulder, getting into the car. "And remember, I warned you." The engine hummed, the headlights illuminating the girl clutched over the body of her only friend. The car sped away, leaving behind a puff of dust and gravel that flew across the road. Jack didn't turn around. He knew he would have seen the look in her eyes, and that look would haunt him for longer than he was willing to admit. The girl was left alone. Her hands still clutched the horse's neck, but the animal's breathing became intermittent, almost imperceptible. At some point it stopped, and the world around her froze. She felt it, felt the last bits of warmth leave her friend's body. Her scream tore through the night. It wasn't just a cry of grief, it was a cry of the soul, filled with pain, despair, and hatred. This sound, unlike a gunshot, was not silent. It echoed in her heart, becoming a part of herself. It was the moment that had ruined her life. Jack Langston sat in his patrol car on the side of a deserted road. Night enveloped the city, but his thoughts were far from the present. He was calm on the outside, but inside a strange, unpleasant uneasiness was eating away at him. The girl's face, distorted with pain and hatred, stubbornly refused to fade from his memory. Her words, spoken in a whisper, echoed in his head, breaking down the carefully constructed walls. "You never had the right." Those words were about him, about his life, about who he had become. But who was he before? Jack's childhood was spent in a small farming town where the world was strictly divided into insiders and outsiders. His father, Gerald Langston, was a man of strong and formidable character. He often said, "The world is divided into those who rule and those who obey, and we Langstons have always been the former." These words became a kind of mantra for Jack that he lived by. His father did not tolerate weakness. Weakness, in his view, was reserved for the others, those who littered their town, their country. Every morning in the Langston home began with a rigid routine: physical training, farm work, and mandatory lessons in true values. Gerald told his son stories about how outsiders were supposedly destroying everything around them. In these stories, they were to blame for everything: poverty, unemployment, even bad weather. Young Jack absorbed these words like a sponge, and did not even try to question whether they were true. But the most powerful influence on him was one incident that occurred when he was only 10 years old. His family lived on the outskirts of town, and one evening a group of black laborers passed by their house on their way to a neighboring town. His father, noticing them, came out on the porch with a rifle in his hand. "This is my land, and you have no right to be here," shouted Gerald. The workers tried to explain themselves, but Jack's father wouldn't listen. He fired a warning shot into the air, then pointed his gun at the oldest of the group. "Get out before I start shooting for real," he added. Jack watched the scene from the window, and his heart was filled with a strange feeling, a mixture of fear, delight, and pride in his father. It was a lesson in strength for him, a lesson in how the real Langston defends his own. Over the years, Jack had become a carbon copy of his father. At school, he avoided any contact with outsiders, repeating memorized phrases about who they were. Any display of friendliness toward them by other students he perceived as a betrayal. Teachers turned a blind eye to his behavior, knowing it was best not to mess with Gerald Langston's son, but it wasn't that simple. In the back of his mind, Jack had doubts, though he stubbornly ignored them. His mother, a woman with a soft voice and warm eyes, sometimes whispered to him at night, "Jack, not everyone is bad. Sometimes you have to look deeper, but never repeat that to your father." These words left a mark, but could not overcome the power of his father's influence. When Jack turned 18, he left home and enrolled in the police academy. He wanted to prove that he was strong, that he was in charge. Police work became for him a continuation of his father's lessons. But now his weapon was not only fists and a gun, but also the law, which he used as an instrument of suppression. Sitting in the car that night, Jack remembered moments from his childhood and youth, and they replayed in his mind like scraps of old film. It seemed to him that he had always been right, that his actions had been justified, but that girl's face, her tears, her desperation, had cracked his confidence. He knew something had changed. But what was it? Regret? Guilt? Or just fear that his past, his beliefs and actions that he thought were right, had actually ruined not only other people's lives, but his own as well? Before we go any further, let's take one more quick pause. Write in the comments where you hear our stories from. Perhaps you've encountered similar situations or know similar life stories. Share your thoughts, it's important. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on exciting new stories. And now, we continue. A few days had passed since that night, but for Jack Langston it was as if time had stood still. He continued to do his job, driving around the city in his patrol car, but there was a strange noise in his head, like a background hum that couldn't be turned off. He tried to convince himself that he'd done the right thing. "I did the right thing," he repeated to himself like an incantation, but the words didn't bring any comfort. On the second day after the incident, the park where everything happened became a gathering place for dozens of people. Local residents brought flowers and candles to the place where the girl said goodbye to her horse. Her photo, taken by one of the eyewitnesses, spread on social networks, and with it the story told by witnesses. People were not silent. Anger and outrage swept the city. "It was inhuman," screamed one of the women who came to the impromptu memorial site. "What law can justify killing an innocent animal and attacking a defenseless girl?" Youth, activists, and even families who had not previously participated in such protests began to take to the streets. Their placards carried simple but poignant messages. Justice for all. No cruelty in the form of law. When hatred becomes a weapon, no one is safe. The girl who suffered that night became a symbol of the fight for justice. Her name was now heard at rallies and her story made local news headlines. Jack saw it all on TV, sitting at the dining room table at home. He kept the news on, but tried not to look at the screen. The reporters' voices sounded muffled, like they were coming through a thick wall. The victim, whose name was not disclosed, said she did not want to remain silent. She asked for help from human rights activists who have already filed a complaint about police misconduct, the announcer broadcast. The city administration refused to comment on the situation, but public pressure continues to grow. Jack gritted his teeth. He turned off the TV and stepped out onto the veranda, looking out at the empty street. His face reflected a mixture of anger and confusion. They don't know anything. They haven't been there. They don't realize that sometimes you have to be tough. He mentally excused himself, but even to himself he was beginning to sound unconvinced. In the department, the situation was even worse. The management didn't openly support Jack, but they weren't about to take responsibility either. He was summoned to a meeting where the head of the department said glumly, "Langston, it's a complicated situation. The public is demanding answers, but we're keeping your name off the case for now. You've worked your shift and you haven't officially violated anything, but, you're better off staying in the shadows." His superior's words sounded like a cover, but Jack realized that this cover could disappear at any moment. He felt like a target, and the feeling grew stronger every day. On the fourth day after the incident, Jack began to notice a change in his co-workers' behavior. Some looked at him with disapproval, others with wary respect, but no one tried to talk to him as they had before. To some, he was a hero who wasn't afraid to act. To others, he was a man who had crossed the line. This isolation depressed him more than he had expected. The incident at the gas station was particularly harrowing. When he went inside to buy coffee, there was a young black guy behind the counter who recognized him immediately. The guy didn't say anything, but his eyes, full of contempt, followed Jack's every move. That look was worse than any words. Jack felt everything boiling inside him. "What are you looking at?" he threw, paying the check. His voice sounded threatening. The guy didn't answer. He just took the money and went back to his work without saying a word. But that silence was louder than any shout. Jack walked out, slamming the door so hard that the glass rattled. By nightfall that day, someone had written, "We will not forget," in paint on the station wall. Jack wasn't sure if it was addressed to him, but he felt a chill run down his spine. He wasn't just a police officer anymore. He was a symbol of everything those who demanded change hated. But even with that, Jack couldn't admit his guilt. His father's words still echoed in his head. The world is divided into those who rule and those who obey. He couldn't believe he had done something wrong. Everything he saw around him seemed to be an attack on his principles, on his way of life. However, in the back of his mind, where he rarely allowed himself to look, doubts began to appear. Doubts he couldn't explain. What if his actions really were not truth, but evil? What if the hatred he thought was his strength was his weakness? For the first time in years, Jack began to ask the questions he had been dreading to hear the answers to. 2 weeks had passed since that night in the park, but the tension surrounding the incident continued to build. Jack Langston, trying to maintain a semblance of calm, continued to patrol the streets, avoiding conversations with his co-workers and glares on the street. But even in the silence of his patrol car, he couldn't shake the heavy feeling that was eating away at him from the inside. Everything changed one ordinary day when he stopped at a roadside cafe for a coffee. Inside, the music was soft, the customers were few, and an elderly woman stood behind the counter. She seemed to recognize him. A faint shadow ran across her face, but she didn't say anything. Jack ordered and sat down at a table in the corner, so as not to attract attention. But it was then that an old newspaper, left by someone on a table nearby, caught his eye. On the front page was her face. The girl's. The one lying on the ground that night, hugging her dying horse. The headline read, "A symbol of justice, its history, its struggle." Jack couldn't take his eyes off the headline, and his hand reached for the paper. He wanted to put it down at first, but something inside made him read on. The article was about a girl whose name he recognized for the first time, Amina Jones. She was only 22. Originally from a small town in the South, she had experienced more tragedy than many in her lifetime. When she was 6, her father died in a car accident, leaving her mother, 2 brothers, and herself in poverty. Her mother, who worked 3 jobs to provide for the family, died of a heart attack when Amina was a teenager. Her older brother disappeared in prison, and her younger brother was killed in a shootout. Her horse, Princess, was a rescue. Amina got the horse by chance. A farmer who had a surplus animal offered it to her mother for a nominal fee. Princess became her friend, her family, something that helped her cope with her loneliness. A few years ago, after an accident at a construction site where Amina worked part-time, she lost the ability to walk normally. But even that didn't break her. She started volunteering at an animal shelter and became known in the local community as a kind-hearted person who was always ready to help. Jack leaned back in his chair, feeling a heavy stone sink into his chest. He closed the paper and looked out the window, but her face continued to stand before his eyes. He remembered her cry, how she had begged him not to touch the horse, how her hands had trembled as she clung to the dying animal. It can't be true, he thought, but something in him knew it was true. Jack left the cafe and was about to leave when he heard a voice behind him. "It's hard to read, isn't it?" He turned around and saw a man in his 40s standing by an old pickup truck. The man held a mug of coffee in his hands and looked at him without fear, but with judgment. "What are you talking about?" Jack asked gruffly. "About that article." The man nodded toward the cafe. "I knew Amina, a good girl. She never hurt anyone. Look, I don't have time." Jack took a step toward the car, but the man didn't stop. "You think you saw her that night, but you don't know anything about her. Shooting her horse. It wasn't just cruel, it broke her." Jack turned around, looking at the man. His face was cold, but inside he was seething. "She broke the law," he said shortly. "I had no choice." "The law?" The man grinned bitterly. "A law that allows you to destroy other people's lives? Do you really believe that?" Silence hung between them. Jack felt the man's words hit something deep inside him. "Do you know her?" he asked, not wanting his voice to shake. "I knew her mother. She was a strong woman who raised her children in love despite everything that happened to them. Amina's the same way. Was. After that night, she's not the same. She lost everything, you know? Everything." Jack got into the car, feeling something change inside him. Amina's story echoed in his head. He tried to justify himself by repeating his father's words. "We are strong. They are weak. The law is a weapon." But for the first time in his life, he began to question whether it was the right weapon to use. His hands trembled on the steering wheel, and his heart beat as if he were facing something that could not be avoided. Perhaps, for the first time in a long time, he began to see what he had always tried to ignore. The faces of the people whose lives he was destroying were as real as his own. Jack Langston could not sleep. For the last few days his mind had been filled with images. The girl's face, her screams, the blood on the ground, the motionless body of the horse. Amina's story, read in an old newspaper, had become an unbearable burden. He wanted to forget, but the attempt was futile. Instead, every morning he woke up thinking, "What can I do?" He knew that apologizing wouldn't bring back what he'd lost. But for the first time in his life, Jack felt that saying, "I'm sorry," might be the only right thing to do. One day, after his shift, Jack went to an internet cafe. He realized that using company equipment to search for information about the victim would only aggravate his situation. After a few minutes of searching, he found her name in one of the announcements. Amina was participating in an event organized by volunteers to raise money for the restoration of an animal shelter. This was his chance. The event, held in a small cultural center, was crowded. People were talking, laughing, showing each other pictures of rescued animals. Jack, dressed in a simple jacket and jeans, felt out of place. He walked past the crowd, feeling people squinting at him. Some recognized him. Their looks were full of contempt. "What's he doing here?" He heard a whisper behind him. "That's the cop who shot her horse, isn't it?" Jack tried not to pay attention. He was looking for her. And then, finally, he spotted her. Amina was standing at a booth with pictures of animals, talking quietly to a middle-aged woman. Her hair was in a ponytail. She was leaning on crutches, and her face looked calm but tired. Jack took a few steps in her direction, but was stopped by a man wearing a shirt with the shelter's logo on it. "You don't belong here," he said coldly, blocking the way. "I just want to talk to her," Jack replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Talk? After everything you've done?" The man could barely contain his anger. "Get out before trouble starts." "I know what I did. I know it can't be undone," Jack replied, his voice trembling. "But please, let me at least try." The man stared at him for a long moment before reluctantly backing away. Jack walked toward Amina, his steps tentative. She noticed him, and her eyes immediately filled with tension. The woman standing next to him stepped back quietly, giving them space. "What are you doing here?" Amina asked coldly, clutching her crutch. "I came to apologize," he replied, trying not to avert his gaze. "Apologize?" She grinned bitterly. "Do you think words can make a difference?" Jack swallowed. "No, I don't think so. But I can't keep quiet anymore. What I did, it was wrong. I can't bring your horse back. I can't change that night. But I want to do everything in my power to make up for it." Amina was silent, her gaze drilling him. "You didn't just ruin my night. You ruined my life. The princess was all I had left. And now you're standing here saying you want to fix things? Why?" "Because I realized I was wrong," he answered quietly. "All my life I believed I was right, that I was protecting order. But I hated it blindly. And I see it only now." Amina continued to stare at him, but her expression became less stern. "If you really want to do something," she said finally, "prove it. Not to me, to yourself." The next day, Jack began looking for ways to help. He contacted the orphanage, offering to help with the rebuilding, but his offer was met with disbelief. However, he managed to persuade them to let him volunteer. Every time he appeared, people looked away, whispered, and sometimes loudly expressed their displeasure. His colleagues at the station were not left out either. "Are you out of your mind, Langston?" One of the officers was indignant. "You go where people hate you." "Maybe they're right," Jack replied, not wanting to make excuses. "Do you really think they'll ever take you back? You'll always be the enemy to them?" "Maybe, but that doesn't mean I shouldn't try." A few months passed. Jack began to notice changes in himself. Working side by side with people he had previously considered enemies, he began to see their pain, their strength, their humanity. One evening, as he was cleaning the shelter, Amina approached him. "You know," she said quietly, I thought I'd never forgive you, and maybe I won't, but I can see that you're really trying." Jack nodded, not knowing what to answer. Sometimes words mean nothing, only actions. She turned and walked away, leaving him alone with his thoughts. At that moment, Jack realized that the path to redemption was not a goal, but a process, and that process was just beginning. It's been a year since that fateful night. The city of Escalating City was no longer the same. The protests had subsided, and the tide of public anger had slowly subsided. But for Jack Langston, everything changed forever. He left the police force, a decision made after months of internal struggle. Now he volunteered at a shelter where he once met more scorn than kindness. Every day was a step into the unknown for him. Amina still kept her distance. Although they often crossed paths at the orphanage, she never made eye contact with him. Their conversations were limited to short, dry phrases. But Jack didn't complain. He realized he deserved it. One rainy fall day, Jack was finishing cleaning the shelter when his owner approached him. "Langston," he began, a little unsure, "can you get these meds to a nearby shelter? They're overcrowded right now and we need help." Jack nodded, took the boxes, and loaded them into the old pickup truck. He was used to running errands without too many questions. But when he arrived at the neighborhood shelter, the first thing he saw was Amina. She was standing at the entrance, wrapped in a warm scarf, talking to a volunteer. Jack froze for a moment, feeling the tension stiffen his body. Her gaze, as if sensing his presence, lifted. "You again?" she said, frowning slightly. "I was asked to deliver this," he replied calmly, nodding at the boxes. Amina didn't say anything, just gestured to where to take the medicines. Jack walked past her, feeling her silence weighing on him more than any words could. After unloading, Jack stopped at a small table in the corner. He wanted to leave, but something inside made him stay. He sat down and looked at Amina, who approached, holding a mug of hot tea. "Why do you keep doing that?" she asked suddenly, her voice quiet but tense. Jack looked up. "Because it's the right thing to do," he answered. "Because it's the only thing I can do right now." "What are you trying to prove? That you're no longer the one who did what you did?" Her question hit him like a hammer. He closed his eyes, gathering his thoughts. "I can't prove anything," he said at last, "but I can try." Amina looked at him for a long moment, her gaze heavy, penetrating. "You know, the night you killed the princess, I thought I hated you more than anyone in the world." Her voice got a little louder. "And I'm not sure that's changed." "I understand." He nodded. "But you know what struck me more?" She continued. "It's that you came back. You were the one who destroyed everything, but then you came back when you could just hide." Jack didn't know what to answer. "I don't forgive you," she said, lowering her gaze, "but maybe, someday." Her words were like a ray of light in the darkness, but they also carried a pain that would not disappear so easily. That same evening, Jack was about to leave the shelter when he heard loud shouting. He ran outside and saw a group of teenagers throwing stones at the windows. They were shouting something about the shelter taking money from normal people. Jack didn't hesitate. He ran up to the teenagers and shouted loudly, "Stop it!" They turned around, their gazes full of hatred. "Is that you? Langston?" One of them recognized him. "The cop who kills?" Jack tensed, but didn't back down. "Yes, I am, and I'm not a cop anymore. I'm here to protect this place." "Do you expect us to believe you?" shouted the other. "No," Jack answered, "but it doesn't matter." They left, dropping a couple of threats, but their glances remained barbed. Jack returned to the orphanage where Amina met him. "You knew they could have attacked you?" she said. "Yes," he replied. "Why?" "Because I have to," he said quietly. She was silent, and in that silence was the moment when something between them began to change. Jack left that night, but he knew that not all was lost. His journey was just beginning. Amina stared after him, feeling no anger for the first time. She knew forgiveness didn't come quickly, but maybe faith in humanity was still possible. The end of the story is left open. Redemption is not the end of the journey, it's the beginning. And Jack Langston had just taken his first step. Write in the comments what you think about this story. Have you had any incidents of racism in your life? Share your thoughts and experiences. We really need to hear from each and every one of you. We value your opinion and are grateful to have you with us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and give us a like to support us and not miss new stories. We wish you a good day and warmth in your heart.